make sure that he is delivering for London, and that he's also spending our money wisely. And we have another duty, which is to investigate matters of importance to Londoners. So it gives us a much wider role than just having to investigate the mayor and his functions. And we do that in a variety of ways. So we have meetings of the whole assembly. So every month we have a mayor's question time when the entire assembly meets and we put questions to the mayor. We have our plenary sessions, again, all 25 members are there. And we tend at that to look at things like transport, we can look at housing, but we also have in the past, for example, looked at the royal parks. We've looked at poverty in London. So that remit can be quite wider. We then have a committee system, a bit like the House of Commons that you probably heard about today. So we have, as you would expect, our Transport Committee, Housing Committee, Environment Committee, Planning, and Police and Crime Committee. And at that, each party will send a few members and they will have regular meetings and produce reports after they have conducted investigations into topical issues. And those reports will often come up with recommendations that they think the mayor and other parties should implement. So, for example, we have previously done scrutiny investigations of the Police and Crime Committee. When I was chair of it, we looked at stop and search and looked at the disproportionality, particularly amongst young black men. In that investigation, we made recommendations to the police at that time about how they should reform the use of stop and search. In the Environment Committee, we've looked at the circular economy, what we can do to make sure that we waste less, and what we can all do to actually ensure that circular economy comes into being, so that we're reusing materials rather than throwing them away. In housing, for example, they've done lots of reports on the mayor's promise to deliver council housing, which he has met. They've looked at private renters, looking at the condition of buildings and so forth. So that's just a brief overview about how the Assembly works. And of course, on top of that, constituents such as yourselves often write into us and we try and sort out some of those problems as well. So I've recently had, today for example, I've had complaints about the Thames Clippers, not being enough staff on the boats on the river. I've had complaints about a local planning application locally, and I've had a request for TfL to give a building in one of our station forecourts over to a community group to use for an exhibition. So our days are very varied. You never quite know what's going to happen. But I hope that was a good introduction to our work.
Absolutely, I learned a lot, and I have no doubt that the other attendees will have as well. Councillor Clarke, would you mind sharing your own insights?
Yeah, so I won't repeat what Joanne has said because she's given such a very thorough overview of the work of the Assembly. I'm a new Assembly member, so I was just elected in May of this year. I've had a total of 1 committee meeting, so I've only attended the Fire and Emergency Response Committee so far, and I mean, apart from things like Mayor's Question Time, so I haven't really got into the works of the committees yet. But what I have done so far is spent a lot of time on casework, and as Joanne describes, it's heavily varied. Joanne and I's constituency share a boundary in parts, but I do get quite a lot around TfL roads, and tube noise seem to be my top 2 at the moment, but also things around major regeneration areas, particularly in Barnet. And on the Camden side, I pick up a lot of issues around concerns around policing. I think all constituencies are really interesting. If you have a look at the map of the London Assembly constituencies, what they sort of did was did a bit of almost a pizza slice of London. And so most of them serve part of inner London and then part of outer London. And because of that, as anyone will know, zone 5 and 6 are very different from zone 1 and 2. And it means that the constituency members are serving a wide range of residents, but also a wide range of issues. And sometimes, well, actually often the case, you have 2 different or even 3 different council makeups. So Barnet, you may know, is it's a Conservative administration, and Camden is Labour. So you're dealing with councils that have very different political outlooks and how they view their infrastructure, particularly how they view their roads. So Camden will be, more pro low traffic neighbourhoods, whereas Barnet will be more pro car. So it's really interesting, and it's as an Assembly member, it's about raising the issues that are relevant to the Assembly, but also I think as anyone represented at any level of politics, you're always there to serve constituents and listen to constituents. And my job so far has been around that. I've made lots and lots of visits to schools and businesses and charities in the constituency. I'm also a serving Barnet Councillor. So I was elected in 2018 as Barnet Councillor for a little ward called Childs Hill, which actually isn't that little. It's Barnet's largest ward. And I've got Golders Green and Cricklewood in my ward, which neatly back on to Camden. So I'm a councillor right on the border, and now serving the whole constituency. I think Joanne wanted to leave, and I both wanted to leave time for questions. Is that a good time to end for questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both for such a thorough introduction into the work of the London Assembly. Again, I definitely learned a lot. I've no doubt that the other pupils will have. Does anyone want to kick off with their questions? Otherwise, I can start things off if you'd like. And please feel free to ask any questions at all. If you want to know about how you get into working at the London Assembly, how you build a particular career path in politics, if there's a particular policy area that interests you, like obviously housing is a big concern to Londoners right now, low pollution levels, a big concern to London, young Londoners right now. Anything at all, please feel free to jump in.
It would be good to know from Anne and Joanne what you both did before joining London Assembly, and then why you decided to get involved with local politics and representing London.
Yeah, should I go? I come from the Northwest originally, in Cumbria, near the border with Lancashire and Yorkshire. So I was the first in my family to go to university. So following university, I did a law degree. I became a barrister, and I did that for 10 years. I then had my first child, and at the same time I stepped back from some of my bar work. I was working for the Housing Ombudsman as an adjudicator, and I was really quite frustrated at the lack of provision for younger children locally. So I started to get involved at that point about early years provision. At the same time, I had been a Labour Party member for a while, but not particularly active. So I started to get involved locally with my party, and then you're probably all too young, but in 1997, when the Labour when Labour won the election after 20 years of Conservatives being in power, I was campaigning locally in Southgate for Stephen Twigg, who defeated a cabinet minister at the time called Michael Portillo, and it was quite a big moment. And so I was at that point, I was quite heavily active in my local party, and it was suggested to me that I perhaps should stand for election myself locally. So I did. So I stood for my local area, and I became a local councillor in Enfield. I became a councillor for 8 years, and as part of that, I took up my great interest, which was children and young people, and I became the chair of the Early Years Partnership in the borough. And that was a time when lots of money was going into early years provision, so we were setting up children's centres and neighbourhood nurseries. So yeah, that was my big focus. And then the local assembly seat became vacant, and so I stood along with some other very good women for it, and I was lucky enough that my party selected me. And then I've now been doing this job for 17 years and thoroughly enjoy it. And can I say, just in my deputy mayor role, I am responsible for education, so that children and young people agenda is still dear to my heart and something I'm working on. But Anne, do you want to say why you did?
So I've never heard your story, Joanne, and what's amazing, it's remarkably similar to mine. So that's fantastic. But actually, I certainly had never in a million years thought I would be standing for council or doing anything of this sort. As you can probably tell from my accent, I originally come from Chicago and moved here as a student initially in 1998, and then had an internship and a job and all that stuff, got married, and had 2 children. I worked in marketing, women's wear marketing, and then when the children were born, I took up a job initially volunteering with Sure Start, but then working with them in Kilburn. And at the time I was living in Camden, so the other part of my constituency. Like many people who live in Camden or central London, as soon as children are involved, more space is suddenly needed, and we moved to Barnet in 2008. What happened? So I became a citizen in 2007. And at the same time joined the Labour Party. But like Joanne, I wasn't immediately very involved. I just shared Labour values, and I wanted to be a member because actually I could vote in Britain for the first time, because before becoming a citizen, depending where you come from, but from the United States, you can't vote in Britain until you're a citizen. So I joined the Labour Party in 2007, and I was a governor at the local primary school where my kids went, and Barnet Council was trying to close the library and was doing a whole they call it a reorganization of the libraries, which pretty much meant closing or losing space, or all sorts of stuff that I thought were immediately detrimental to the community I lived in, but also to people across Barnet, and particularly Barnet's poorest communities, where I live in Cricklewood. And so it was disadvantaging the already disadvantaged. And there was a woman called Sarah Sackman who was standing for Parliament, who's a really good friend of mine and a big figure in the Jewish labour movement. And I became very, very involved with her campaign in 2014. She sadly didn't win a seat, but we're still very good friends. And when it came to selection for the 2018 local council seats in the local Labour Party, I was not immediately interested. But what we really wanted to do was win council seats. And it's sort of politics sometimes when it comes to standing for seats. It's not always that you plan to do it. It's just that opportunities arise and you can make a choice to miss those opportunities or to take them. And I was having a conversation with a man called Mike Katz, who you might know. He's the chair of the Jewish labour movement and lives just over the border in Camden from me. And Mike said to me, are you standing for selection for Childs Hill? And I was like, no, of course not. And he said, well, how would you feel if you woke up the day after the election and you had 3 Labour councillors and you weren't one of them? And I said, Mike, that would be absolutely fantastic. Like, that sounds amazing. Because at the time I had 2 Conservative councillors and 1 Lib Dem, and Barnet was controlled by, the Conservatives. And in any event, there was a bit of triangulation and convincing for me to stand, and I did. And quite sadly, you become very close with the other people you stand with, because you council seats tend to have 2 or 3 members, and I serve on a 3-member ward, and I won a seat and the other 2 did not, and that's always been a bit kind of perhaps sometimes more bitter than sweet, but still disappointing, because and I'm still very close with them. But in any event, Andrew Dismore, who held the seat of Barnet and Camden, announced he was retiring, and asked if I was interested in standing, because I had experience in both boroughs, and again, it was sort of not something I'd immediately aspired to do, but something I was definitely interested in doing. And like Joanne, you then sort of at the mercy of your own party to see who gets selected. And I was lucky to be selected. It's usually a very marginal constituency, so a selection by no means means you'd be elected. This has been both a Conservative and a Labour held seat. So yeah, I was really lucky to be elected. It's a huge honour. It's a absolutely fabulous constituency. I'm sure every constituency member thinks they serve the best constituency, but you know, that's where we are.
Intra-London rivalry continues in so many ways. Who's the best between Camden and Barnet and Enfield and Haringey? As an lifelong Enfield resident, I have to say Enfield. I can help kick off